Hey, Vlad here, devinsideyou.com. Welcome to another video. In the previous couple of videos, we talked about Monocle, and it turns out Monocle is not the only lens library in the Scala ecosystem. A worthy alternative is a library called Quicklens, and so today we're going to have a sort of like a crash course for Quicklens, but it's going to be mixed with an advanced Monocle tutorial. I'm going to explain more after the intro. As in most of my videos, I'm running an Ubuntu 18.04 virtual machine, and I'm using Windows as a host, and Windows has a virtual desktop feature with shortcuts allowing me to switch between Windows like this and Ubuntu like that. So if you were to go to Quicklens website, which we're going to do in a couple of seconds, we're going to see that they have a nice README file with a bunch of examples of how to use their library. So what I did was I basically went through the entire README and implemented exactly the same thing in Monocle, and I put all of that on GitHub, which is over here. So I already have it opened. It's on my Dev Inside You GitHub account. It's called Monocle versus Quicklens, but it's not supposed to be a battle or anything like that. It's supposed to be sort of like a cheat sheet for converting between these two great libraries. All right. So I'm going to open the website for Monocle, and I'm going to open the website for Quicklens like this. We already know Monocle. We played around with it in the previous videos. This is Quicklens. So if we start scrolling down, we're going to see that, there's some sort of headline and there's an example, headline and example, headline and an example. So what I did over here was, in fact, I'm going to show it to you in Ubuntu. Let me open VS Code. I already have it cloned, and you obviously can clone it for yourself as well, right? So what I did was basically I pretty much don't have anything in the main, in the production code level. There's a little bit of code. I'm going to show it to you later. But then I have a bunch of tests, right? So basically every heading in that README file became a test, right? So there, for example, this one is called modify deeply nested fields in case classes. So if we go back to README, we're going to see the first one is called modify deeply nested fields in case classes. All right, so basically we're going to go through all of them, and obviously all the tests are green. Let me start SPT real quick. All right, let me just run the tests, and they should be green. There we go. All right, so the first thing that we're going to notice is that it says 10, but we have 13 files over here. So what happened is that, the ones for 11 and 12, which are lenses and composing lenses, I just put them into the first one, right? So if we go in there, there's going to be just a comment saying, that they're over there. Okay, so the same thing is going to happen for composing lens. Okay, so what we're going to do now is basically we're just going to go through all of them, and I'm going to show you how, well, first of all, how Quicklens does it, but you can obviously see it from the README, and also I implemented the same thing in Monocle, and we're going to go through a couple of gotchas here and there. All right, so let me go to this first file, and let me explain to you how everything is structured over here. So first of all, let me create some more space. Let me close that. Okay, so most of these files they contain only one test, right? Even though they contain more than one assertions, they pretty much contain only one test, and they all look sort of the same. They start with some structure, with some example. This is exactly the same example as in the README. So for example, over here we have a structure which basically we have a person which has address and an age. We can ignore age for now, but basically this is a typical Lance example with a nested structure, right? So person has address is a street has a name, okay, and there's also an age somewhere over there. All right, so we have property-based tests. So if I open that, then we're going to have this huge for all, and VS Code doesn't allow me to collapse everything. But basically, we have this for all where we're generating a person, right, which is the top level thing. And also, Monocle, not Monocle, Quicklens gives you alternative syntax for lances. And so I'm also generating a Boolean over here, and sometimes we're going to run with this syntax, and sometimes we're going to run with that syntax. All right, so basically, some input is being generated with the help of the library called Scala check shapeless, and over here. We're going to have an example for calling modify on the lenses, and we're going to have an example for set. And so I have two expected versions, right? So this is basically where I'm doing the transformation manually, right, by nesting these copy calls, right? So the first one is modified because we're going to use the previous value to call to uppercase, and the second one is set, where we're not going to use the previous value. We're just going to set it to this. All right. What happens after this is we have two scopes, one for Quicklens and one for Monocle, like this. And if we go into Quicklens, we're going to see basically there's a bunch of assertions. Assert. Whoops, that one was already collapsed, like that. All right. Now this assert, I defined it myself. I just basically the main thing that I want you to focus on is what is happening over here in this closure, right? So this is where the person comes in, and then we're going to use Quicklens to call something to modify something in the person, and the same is going to happen to for Monocle. And therefore, I wanted to create my own assert, which basically allows me to put the input and the expected version over here, right? But there's nothing fancy in there. If I jump in there, it's basically just doing, we give it the function, which is the important thing. It acts on the input, and we expect it to be, what we expect it to be. All right. So let me go back. Let's start with the first example. So we're putting something in, and we're expecting, the modified version over here, right? So this one, basically, we're expecting the name to be uppercase, okay? And the way we do this with Quicklens, again, this is pretty much copy-pasted from the README, is that, we can use it with one syntax, and we can use it with another syntax, right? So the first syntax is very simple. We're just saying person.modify, and then we're specifying which field, right? So we can drill down to the field, typical lances, as we have seen in the previous videos, and then we'll say using to uppercase, okay? For set, we're not going to say using, we're going to say set2. Okay, so one is called using, the other one is called set2, and the way we sort of summon the lens is by saying modify. Okay, so this is the first two, and the other ones are these examples. If we go back, the other ones, like the next two, are the examples for lenses, and these two are the examples for composing lenses. So I'm going to open them in just a second. Okay, so let's go and look at Monocle. So if I open that, we're going to see exactly the same 6 assertions. 3, 4, 5, and 6. All right. So one important thing that I sort of forgot to mention is that for Quicklens, we're pretty much always going to need only this one import, comsource2ml Quicklens, all right, _. For Monocle, we will sometimes need more. So in the first couple of examples, they're going to look very, very similar. So we're going to need only one import. But for the future ones, we're going to need more. All right, so the first ones that we're going to do in Monocle, they pretty much look the same, right? But instead of like saying person.modify, we're saying person.lens. Okay, so over here we're saying person.modify, here we're saying person.lens. The rest is pretty similar, but then instead of this using, we're saying modify, and instead of set2, we're saying set. Okay, so we have seen a bunch of these examples in the previous 2 videos, but we're kind of new to Quicklens. But as of right now, Monocle is actually kind of winning because it takes like 1 or 2 characters less. One of the things you need to know is that I believe Monocle was there first. And Quicklens has been around since 2015, and I believe at that time Monocle didn't have this fancy syntax. All right, so Monocle focuses on being very, very formal on the concept of the optics themselves and the way that you can create them and you can reuse them and you can compose them. Quicklens doesn't do that. Quicklens just offers you a very, very fancy DSL where you sort of don't even need to think about what's happening behind the scenes. All right, so therefore, one of the things in the README is showing you that you can still reuse lenses, and this is what I'm showing over here. So if I open these two, right? So basically you can just create the lens like this, okay? And you can then use it, right? So which means that you have, lens is a thing the same way as it is in Monocle, and you can reuse it and you can also compose it, okay? I'm doing the same thing for Monocle, but it's basically kind of boring, right? So again, there are 2 ways of syntax. One is like this and the other one is like that. And by the way, I believe they also have slightly different types. I'm not 100% sure about this. Come on, show me the type. Useless. All right, so let's look at Monocle. So it's basically, the same thing. Just as a reminder, this is a fancy syntax for Monocle, which creates a so-called, I believe it's called applied lens, right? Where it basically already knows that it's not going to be a standalone thing. It's going to be a thing for a person. In fact, I believe that this example is actually incorrect. Yeah, maybe we should do it the other way around. Maybe we should actually go and fix this real quick. So we should compose the lens like this by saying gen lens for person, and then please go into, I'm sorry, I'm just going to copy that. I'm just going to copy it like this. Okay, and then we're going to use the person over here. All right, so I believe this is actually, this demonstrates this actually better. And for that, we might actually need another import because I think we're importing only that. So let's actually go and import Monocle macros like this. All right, so I believe that this should be enough. Come on, compile. Why does it take so long to compile? It's just like one tiny thing. All right, so this better demonstrates the same thing as over there. All right, so I can actually go and copy that. I'm going to commit this afterwards. All right, and the other examples is composing lenses, right? So for Monocle is basically bread and butter, but for Quicklens it's something special like this, right? So as you can see, this is very similar, right? So there's one syntax which goes like this, and you compose by saying and then modify, and another syntax just goes like this, right? So it's basically exactly the same as before, and this one is actually very similar to what we just did in Monocle, right? Because in Monocle it was basically, you know, gen lens like this, okay? But the rest was kind of similar, okay? So you compose them with and then modify, so either like this or like that, which is, you know, same thing, okay? You use them almost the same way. So for this syntax, you give the, you know, the person to the lens right away, and only then you call using. This one is more close to Monocle. Okay, so if we go down to Monocle, as we have seen in the previous videos, what is happening over here? It doesn't like that. Found blah 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 required. Yeah, we forgot to give it the person, right? Person. Okay, because my assert thing, it actually wants this thing to result in a person. All right, so the composition in Monocle is very straightforward. Instead of and then modify, you're just saying compose lens. And remember, Monocle has more optics. It doesn't have just lenses, so you can say compose lens, compose prism, compose optional, and so on and so on. Okay, so these two are pretty much exactly the same. Yeah, and over here I use this, you know, this proper syntax. Over there I kind of forgot. So yeah, but no worries. I'm gonna commit the whole thing afterwards. All right, so even though this is not a battle, there is still, you know, sort of no clear winner. Let's go to the next one. So the next one is chaining modifications. All right, so over here we have exactly the same structure, and we have pretty much exactly the same expected modified person, but in this case we're actually modifying two fields, right? So we're in fact I mixed them a little bit, so we're still modifying the name by doing two uppercase, but we're also setting the age. And in the other one we're doing it the other way around. We're setting the name, but we're modifying the age. All right, so if you look at Quicklens, so Quicklens gives you this modify using, and then you can just go and do the same thing again, right? So you can just modify and then set to, or, you know, the other way around. You can do modify set to and then modify using. And Monocle offers you exactly the same thing, right? So you can do person lens and then modify and then lens again and then set. Okay, so this one was super straightforward. We don't need to waste any more time on this one. All right, but again, I believe when Quicklens was invented, this syntax was not possible. All right, modify conditionally. Okay. So same structure, okay, and over here we have the same expected, right? So we're not touching the age anymore, and because we have only one expected, I believe we're only going to be setting stuff, right? So we're not going to do modification, okay? So the way you do it in Quicklens is you import, as always, the same import, and you're saying modify, and then it has this fancy set to if defined, right? So basically you can give it an option, and if it's defined, it's going to change it, and if it's not defined, it's going to leave it exactly as is, as you can see over here, right? So what we're expecting is exactly what came in, because it's not. And the same thing for booleans, right? So you can do, instead of set to if defined, you can do set to if, and if it's true, then it's going to do it, and if it's false, then it's gonna you know, then it's gonna not do it. Okay, so Monocle doesn't have anything like that, but in fact I added my own, right? So if we look at Monocle, and basically, it's going to look exactly the same. It's going to have set to if defined, and it's going to have set to if. And this is the only code that I added. So if I jump in there, you're going to see that we're actually in this package object, which is the only code that I have in the production thing, right? We're basically defining a couple of extension methods to this apply lens. Sorry, to this one, to this apply lens. Okay, so basically this is just for better naming, right? Because an apply lens, what's inside is the source and the and the actual lens, right? So basically an apply lens basically just brings in, you know, the person and the lens itself, puts them together. Okay, so and we just have these set to if and set to if defined, and basically we're saying, okay, so if condition, then please call the set, otherwise just return the source as it was before. And the same thing over here, we're just folding over option. You know, if it's empty, then we're just gonna return source as before, otherwise we're just gonna call set. All right, nothing super fancy. So now both Quicklens and Monocle have that. Okay, let's go to the next one. Modify several fields in one go. And this is going to be the one where Quicklens clearly wins over here. Okay, so we have a slightly different structure. We just have a person, right? So there's nothing nested anymore. Okay. So we have first name, last name, simple strings, but the middle name is an option, okay? And basically what we're expecting is that we're going to go through to every field, and we're just going to capitalize it. And remember, the middle name is an option, so we basically, if it's there, then we're going to capitalize it. Otherwise, we're not going to do this, okay? So this is the, the manual change. And the way we do this in Quicklens is we're just basically calling modify all. Right, so we're calling modify all was first name and was last name, and there's a fancy thing over here called each that we can call on things like option or list or set or something, basically anything that is traversable. All right, so we do that, and then we just say using capitalize, the same as we were doing before, right? So you can do person.modify, give it one field, and then say using, or you can say modify all, and you can give it all of these things, and it understands how to traverse options and lists and so on. All right, Monocle doesn't have anything like this, and what there are several ways to implement this, and I tried to find the ones that are as less boilerplatey as possible. Okay, so let's go over here. So first of all, we need a bunch of imports. Okay, and the first one that you can do is basically by doing this thing manually, as we were doing before, right? Basically going through each field and doing it manually, right? So this is actually my sort of favorite, because it's if you're a beginner to lenses, this is like the the very straightforward one. You don't need to understand anything fancy. Okay, so over here we have the middle name, which happens to be an option, which means that we need to compose it with a prism, because it can be a sum, it might be a none. As in the previous video, you have seen a prism basically chooses one of the what are they called? The elements of the subtype. Whatever, it chooses only one of them, right? And in fact, we don't even need to do like gen prism and generate a prism that goes from option to sum. It's built into Monocle, so it's over here in monocle.std, which stands for standard, right? So these are standard in this case prisms, right? So you can go to option and you can call sum. If we jump in there, it's basically a prism over here, right? So it's in a map to a, oh, there is an either there. Why is there an either there? Doesn't really matter. It implements it for you. Another way to do exactly the same thing is basically by going to the layer above and saying, okay, we don't want to do anything with lances, because we know that when we compose a lance with a prism, we actually arrive at an optional. So what we can do is, because as of right now, if you remember from the previous video, Monocle doesn't implement the actual hierarchy of the lances, but of the optics, but every lance is, for example, an optional. Okay, so for now we need to convert a lance into an option manually. I believe in Monocle 3 they want to implement the actual hierarchy, and therefore we would not need to do this. So that this color compiler would just simply infer the type that that this is an optional of a of string, I believe in this case. Okay, for now we need to go as optional, and over here we're doing the same thing as over here, right? So basically composing a lens with a prism, and therefore what comes out is an optional. Okay, and then we just map all of them, like all of these lenses, to modify capitalize, right? So what comes out over here is a sequence of functions. Then we just collapse all of them. This is simple function composition, and at the end we have this one big function, and we just apply it to the person. Yet another thing that you could do is you could import cat implicits, and you could go to the layer even above. Above optional is a traversal. Okay, so you can go to traversal, and therefore you can compose a traversal over here with traversal dot from traverse. Okay, so basically instead of doing the prism with a standard option, we're going straight to traverse, and the result is going to be exactly the same. As you have seen, all of these tests are actually green. And if this was too fast, you can obviously go to GitHub and look at it at your own pace. You can clone it, you can play around with it, see all the types and do whatever you want. All right, let's go to the next one. Traverse options lists maps using each. All right, whoops, didn't want to do that. Open it. I think you can open it like this. All right. Cool. Let me close this one. All right. So traverse options lists maps using each, right? So as I already mentioned, like everything that's pretty much like smells like traversable, you can call each on it. Okay. So in this case, we have person. It's even simpler than before. A person has a bunch of addresses, right? So not just one. And address has not just a street, but it's an optional street, right? So you can have, you need like sort of two prisms. Okay, well, actually, you need one traversal and one prism. Okay, so what we're basically expecting over here is that we're going to dig into the street name and we're going to uppercase it. Okay, so manually it would look like this. With Quicklens, you would just be able to say, just modify as if it was a regular field, and you go to addresses, which is a list, and then you can say each, right? So it's basically a traverse into the list. Then we're going to have a street. Then we're going to say each again, and it's going to figure out that it needs a prism. And then after that, we actually want to access the name field, and then we're doing using to uppercase, right? So we're starting to see the cases where Quicklens clearly is winning, because with Monocle, it looks like this. First of all, a bunch of imports, right? And then you have to do basically understand everything that I just said. Okay, you need to start with a lens to addresses, which is a list. Why doesn't it show me stuff? What is happening? Come on, it should be able to show me that this, yeah, there we go. This is a list of address. Then we need to compose it with traversal because it's a list, right? Then over here, we need to make sure that we can go into the street, but the street is an option. Okay, and because it's an option, we have to go again to compose prism, or as before, you can do compose traversal. Okay, right? And then we're going to be in the street. Okay, and after that, we just need a lens into the name, right? And only then we can say modify to uppercase, right? So basically doing exactly what I just said, but over here in Quicklens, you basically have this DSL that does all of this for you, and you pretty much don't need to understand what is happening behind the scenes. And in Monocle, you kind of do. All right, let's go to the next one, which is number 7. Number 7, which is modify specific sequence elements using at. All right, so we have the same structure. Okay, in this case, we have 2 addresses. We have street 1 and street 2, both options. All right, and now we're expecting that, oh my God, this looks complicated. Hold on. Oh, okay, so basically, a bit later in Quicklens, we're going to write the code that will only go to the second one, right? Because it's going to be at the index 1, right? Remember, the lists are 0 based, right? So this is the position 0. This is the position 1, and for the name, we're going to do 2 uppercase, right? So manually, it looks a bit complicated. Essentially, we're digging into the addresses, and then we're making sure that that if it's less than 2 elements, then we're just going to return them as is. And if it does have at least 2 elements, then we're going to grab this one, we're going to modify it a little bit, and then we're going to compose, we're going to construct a new list, right? So we're going to leave the head the same as it was before, leave the tail the same as it was before, but the second element, right, the one at index 1, we're going to modify. Okay, so the way we do this with Quicklens is just by doing that. We can just say addresses at 1 over here, right? And the rest stays pretty much the same. Addresses at 1, street.each.name, and then using to uppercase. Okay, and notice that in Quicklens, if you put in an index that is not there, that it's actually going to throw an exception. This does not happen in functional programming libraries like Monocle. So Monocle is actually going to leave your list alone. So this is how it's done in Monocle, right? So we can go and we can say compose optional, right? So we're starting as always with a lens that goes to addresses. Okay, we're doing compose optional, and we're using this index 1, which comes from here, right? So Monocle has a bunch of type classes that I didn't explain to you in the previous video, right? But basically it's very similar, right? So you compose an optional for something that is at position 1. It's an optional because it might not be there, and after that we're pretty much doing the same thing, right? So we go into the street. The street happens to be, in this case, I went to traversal, right? So before we went to the prism, right? Yeah. So no, we also went to the traversal. We stopped doing the prism. Okay, even though it's an option. We just went there. Okay, whatever. Right. So you can also do a gen prism here. Okay. So you just go into. I'm sorry, not here. Over here. Okay, so maybe there's going to be an address, and then we're going to go into the street, and then street is an optional, so we're going to go to traversal, or maybe through prism if you prefer that. Okay, and after that we're going to go through the name, and then we're going to do modify to uppercase. And notice that again, if it's actually not there, what will come out is exactly the same thing as came in, right? So no exception is going to be thrown. This is actually kind of disappointing. Also, by the way, I'm kind of new to Quicklens. Maybe there is a way, like I was trying to find something like add option or something like this. I couldn't find it, right? So but this is not a major thing. I believe this is a thing that can be added in the future release. Okay, but it's kind of annoying that you need to know that whenever you use at, you actually need to know that an exception is going to be thrown. Another thing that you need to know, Monocle distinguishes between at and between index, because Monocle has at as well, which we're going to see in the next example. So index is for things that have a position. right? And therefore, the length of this list might not allow you to put the thing back in, right? Whereas at in Monocle is used for maps, and therefore you can always put something in, right? So for maps, I believe it's, so if you can put something in, I believe for maps it's an at is a prism, and an index is an optional. I believe so. I believe so. All right. So in fact, let's go to the next example, which is modify specific map elements using at. So you will see that for Quicklens, basically nothing changes. The code is going to look pretty much exactly the same. But for Monocle, we're going to use at over here instead of index, right? But it's going to come from the same import because this one imports all of them. All right. Let's go into it. All right, so basically now we have a person which has a name, and it has some map from which goes from string to some property, and the property is just a wrapper around a value. Okay, so we're creating a map with two elements, right? And we're expecting that the second one, the second one, we're gonna have an entirely new property, right? So whatever has been generated by a Scala check shapeless, we're just gonna put a property with a 45 in there, right? And as you can see over here for Quicklens, basically nothing changed, right? We're basically saying property add, and add this particular key, whatever the key was generated, and then we go, basically another lens, we go into the value, and we're setting it to 45. And for Monocle, basically, okay, see, like in this case, I went to Prism for some reason. Okay, we're basically using at instead of index, but the rest is pretty much the same, right? So go in there, we're composing it with a prism. We could have also composed with traversable. I don't know. Sometimes I did that, sometimes I did this. Okay, and then you're composing a lens because you want to go into the value, and you set the 45. It's kind of pretty straightforward if you kind of used to lenses. If you're still a beginner with with optics and with Monocle, if you just like watch my previous video, if you never touched Monocle or optics before, then this might be a little bit overwhelming, like trying to figure this out. Which is why a quick lens might be, I don't know. It's a two-edged sword, right? Because as a beginner, this is much simpler to learn. However, also as a beginner, you don't really understand what's happening behind the scenes, and so you might not know that the same thing is going to happen over here if the key is not there, right? So, and no such element exception is going to be thrown. However, for Monocle, that's not going to happen, right? That's not going to happen. It's just going to leave the map intact. Okay, so we're going to expect the same thing as we're putting in. All right, but again, it's pretty much the same as before, but for Monocle, you need to distinguish between index and at, and for Quicklens, you don't need to distinguish. They just use at for both of them. Let's close these. Let's go to number 9. Okay, so this one is very simple. It's basically for either, right? So you can have a resource, and it either can be an authentication context or an authentication request. If it's a context, then it has a token. Otherwise, it has a URL. And we're not doing property-based testing here anymore. I copy pasted exactly the same example as we had in the README. So let's say that at def time, you're going to have a resource with an authentication context, which is going to have a fake token. And what we're basically expecting is going to be a real resource, right? So something is going to go in there, and it's just going to set real. Okay, so for Quicklens, we basically have this fancy thing called each left, right? So basically saying, for the left one, if it's a left one, then it's going to set it. Okay, and for Monocle, we basically need to do compose prism, and it's in the standard thing. It doesn't only have the standard prisms for options, it also has the standard prisms for either, right? So you're doing either, standard left. The rest is kind of boring, right? So it basically says, compose lens. And for some reason, I stopped using my assert there. Let's do that. Assert. So we're putting in the dev resource, and we're expecting the real resource, right? So over here, the resource comes in. That whole thing is inside, and we're touching the resource, and now we don't need to be that thing to do that thing. All right, let's see. Yeah, resource, like that. Resource. All right, let's do exactly the same thing over here. Assert, dev resource comes in, real resource comes out. So this is the resource, like that. Let's bring this one down like this. We're using the resource over here. No, not the real resource. This one, resource, and now we don't need to do this should be thing. All right, a couple of improvements here and there. All right, let's go to the next one. The next one is modify fields when they're of certain subtype. All right, it's getting more and more interesting. So in this case, we have a different structure. So we have a zoo, which is a bunch of animals, right? And an animal is a typical ADT, right? So it can either be a dog or it can be a cat. I like to sort them like this. All right, so we can either have a cat or we can have a dog. Cats have many lives and therefore they have many different ages. Okay, so over here we basically have a zoo with two elements. Basically, we have a zoo with a list of two elements. We have one dog which is 4 years old, and we have a cat with ages 3, 12, and 13. And what we expect is that if it's a dog, then it's gonna age it by 1 year. And if it's a cat, then it's only going to age, the first element, right? So the one at position 0. And the way you do this with Quicklens is, first of all, you need to modify all, right? And you need to give it, multiple fields now. The first one, you're going to say animals.each, right? Because it's a list. You have to do each because it's, it's a traversal. And then you have a prism over here, which says, when the type is dog, then please, have another lens into the age. Okay, and this one is the same thing. When it's a cat, then please go into the ages, and then please create a I believe in this case it might actually be an optional. Yeah, it's actually an optional, but remember that this thing would explode. Okay, so you go at position 0. Okay, so again, super fancy DSL. You don't need to understand that behind the scenes that there's a traversal and so on and so on. All right, let's look at Monocle. A bunch of imports, and there are a couple of ways to do this. The first one is basically you set every field yourself, right? So basically you go like this. This one, sets the first field, and this one, sets the second field, even though the modify function is exactly the same. Okay, so you're going into animals because it's a list. We need a traverse because it might be an animal, or because it might be a dog and it might be a cat. We need another prism, from animal to dog. And then we're going to need a lens because we want to go from dog, inside a dog to get the age, and only then we can do modify. And because we're using this lens syntax, what comes out over here is another person, right? And therefore we can just do the same thing. Yeah, we're going to do the same. Okay, we can do lens animals, and then because it's a list, we're going to go to the traverse, and then we only need the cats, so we need a prism, and then we only need the ages. It's a lens. But the ages is a list, and so we compose it with an optional that goes into index 0, right? So again, this is an index. Okay, and another way to do this is basically by it's the same as in the second example. In fact, let me go in there, chain modifications, right? So over here, we basically we're either doing it manually or hold on, was it the third one? No. What was the one that we're doing the composition? It's not this one. Conditionally, several fields in one go. This one. Okay. So we were doing either we were doing this in manually, right? So calling lens a bunch of times, or we were putting them all in the sequence and we were doing map, modify, blah blah blah. And the same thing the same thing is happening over here, right? So we're putting them all in the sequence and we're doing map, modify, reduce, left, blah blah blah. So this is exactly the same thing as before, right? So we're just putting like both of these lenses inside. Okay, both this one, which is exactly the same as this one over here, or these 4, which is exactly these over here, right? Whatever rocks your boat. All right. So as you can see over here, Quicklens clearly wins, right? So a bunch of lines of code over here, bunch of imports. With Quicklens, one import, fancy DSL, but it can explode sometimes. But again, I believe that this is something that can be simply fixed in the future. All right, let's close these. So as already mentioned, 11 and 12 we already discussed, and there is pretty much only one left, which is modify nested sealed hierarchies. One of the things that we need to know over here is that in the README it specifies over here that this feature is experimental and might not work due to compilation order issues. Unfortunately, if we click over here, we're going to see that this issue is super old. It's from 2013. It's closed, but it's actually not really fixed. Long story. In any case, so what we have here is an ADT, but it's not as simple as it could be, right? So we have Pat, and Pat has a name. But even though everything underneath basically has a name because a Pat has a name, remember that all of these, macro-based generations of optics, they only pretty much work for products, right? So pretty much they work for case classes. And I mean, they also work for some types, right? But not for something like this, right? So we can generate like stuff for cat and dog and fish, but we can't just go and generate stuff for the Pat. Okay, and we also have this example. I actually believe that it doesn't really matter, so I copy pasted it from the README. But in what is demonstrated here, this was actually kind of unnecessary. You know, the fish is actually a legged pat. Sorry, a fish is actually just a pat, and the cat and dog, you know, they're legged pats, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, so our input is just a bunch of these, right? So it's just a list of pats, right? So we have cat, dog, fish, and what we expect is that we're going to go to all of them, and we're going to append this comma junior thing. All right. So with Quicklens, basically we're ignoring the fact that this is some complicated structure. We're just going to say modify each name, right? So it still says person. It's not a person anymore. It's pat. It's a pat. Okay, same thing over here. Basically, everywhere we say person, we're going to say pat. Whoops, not O-E-T-P-E-T, pat. All right. Okay, so we basically have a pat, and we say each name. All right, pat, because it's a list over here. We're just going to each, and then we're just getting the name as if this was not a complicated structure, right? Very, 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 very simple. Sorry, just like these basically it's like one line, right? So you could like join the lines, and it would be like one line. Okay. In Monocle, it's a bit more complicated. Okay, so basically you have to do it manually, right? So you can sort of start like by traversing the list, right? It's a list of paths, so you can start traversing the list. But then you need to compose a lance. But when you're composing a lance, you can't just go from path to the name, right? So you can't just go from path to the name. You need to figure out which one you have so that Monocle can generate a lance for one of them, right? And this is exactly what's happening here, right? So basically pattern matching on the thing over here. Oh, by the way, we're not even generating the lances in this case. We're creating it ourselves, right? So we're creating a lance ourselves. We're saying, okay, this is how you get the name, right? So you can just go to name because it's a path, but setting the name is different depending on whether you have a cat, fish, or a dog. Even though, this whole implementation, looks the same, like in order to generate a lance over here. So we actually, yeah, so okay, so here's the thing. We're doing the lens manually, right? We're creating it manually, but inside of it, we're using Monocle generated, with macros generated lenses to actually go and modify that field, right? So we don't need to do it manually over here, right? So this code looks exactly the same, but the types are different, right? So this lens is a lens for cats, and this lens is it's a lens for fishes. Okay, and then in the end we're saying modify, and it didn't modify all of that. It should pat. Okay, modify, and then we're giving it the pat. Another way to do this is by putting them all in the sequence, and this way we can reuse a little bit, this traversal. Okay, so we're basically doing the same way as we would be doing manually. However, Monocle doesn't have a fancy syntax for other optics like this, right? So you can do path.lens, but you can't do path.prism, I believe, actually. In fact, I wanted to try this, but I believe we can't do something like prism over there, right? So there's no something like that is not gonna work. Yeah. So Monocle has only this fancy syntax for lances, and therefore we have to generate a sequence where we're starting with a traversal, and then we're basically generating a classic prism, right? So it's a classic ADT. You want to go to the path, but only if it's a cat. And after that, we're just gonna go down to the name, right? So nothing fancy, right? We have a list of paths, so we have a traversal. We need to figure out if it's a cat, so we need a prism. We need to go inside of the cat to get the name, so it's a lens, right? We did this thing, many times in the previous video. And then we basically do the same thing for cat, for dog, and for fish. And we do the same trick as before. We map it, modify, reducing left, composing all of the functions, and we have this one gigantic function. We're applying it to the path. And I believe that this was the last example. We can actually go and do git commit -am improves a couple of things. Come on, show me. What happened here? Oh, man. Improves a couple of this. Oh, Jesus. All right. I'm going to fix this later. Don't worry. And then I'm going to push it. And yeah, that pretty much that pretty much concludes the entire video. So yeah, so let me recap a couple of things, sort of give you sort of like a comparison between Monocle and Quicklens. So you obviously can go and decide for yourself which one you want to use. You probably are leaning towards Quicklens because the syntax is, clearly a winner. But as I already said in the beginning of the video, it's a two-edged sword. On one hand, it's kind of cool that you don't really need to understand what's happening behind the scenes. On the other things, you actually learn a lot when you understand all of these optics, how they're composed together, what laws they have, and so on. Right. So even as a beginner for whom learning this Quicklens DSL is almost trivial, it would help you a lot to understand actually what's happening behind the scenes. Apart from that, apparently the quick lenses, the lenses from Quicklens, apparently they're a little bit faster because I believe what they're generating behind the scenes is not this entire optic composition. They're basically generating this whole copy chain for you. Having said that, most applications these days are I/O bound and not CPU bound, so you have to make sure, you have to profile your application to make sure that your bottleneck is actually somewhere there, somewhere in, in something like Monocle. The last thing that is kind of like sort of missing for me at least, usually when you write a DSL, you write it, when you create a DSL, you create this DSL on top of something, right? So it would be kind of cool if the similar DSL would be created for Monocle, because for now, like for Quicklens, I'm kind of new to it, but it sort of feels like it's a DSL that is built on top of nothing, right? So it's a DSL that just goes and does this thing for you. And so, I might be wrong again because I'm kind of new. But for me, like personally, something is missing. Like I kind of wish that. So by the way, I didn't mention this, but Quicklens doesn't have any dependency on Monocle, right? So this is not just a DSL on top of Monocle, right? It implements its own stuff. Okay. So I kind of wish, first of all, that Monocle would come up with basically just a DSL for these things, and then. Yeah, and then it would pretty much be on par with Quicklens. But again, I'm not judging. The whole purpose of this video was basically sort of like as a cheat sheet. If you're migrating from one library to the other, you can just simply go there and see how, see examples of how this is done. And by the way, I'm kind of have a feeling that we skipped one. I just remembered that we skipped one, a very, very important one. Where is it? There was something was a filter. This one, I believe this one. We totally skipped over this one, I think, because there is a very, very important thing in there. Yeah, we totally skipped over this one. All right, so this one is probably the most important one, and I skipped over it. Crazy. All right, so we have person, address, and street, and we're gonna go. So this manual thing looks very, very complicated, right? Let me actually remove that thing. All right. So basically, we're drilling obviously into names, but not always. Right. So the first one is we're seeing in this or else that we're basically gonna leave it alone if the street is not set. And the second one is that we're only going to modify the name if it starts with a 1. So there is some sort of filtering going on, and filtering in general, filtering is a bit sort of like destructive, right? So if we go to Quicklens, we basically have this example where we're saying person.modify, and then we're going into the addresses and we're using this each where, right? So filter address is a simple function that basically decides, okay, in this case, if it's defined, okay? And the other one, each where says, okay, if it starts with a 1. And if we go to Monocle, the implementation is going to look worse than everything that you've seen before, because first of all, okay, sure, we go into the addresses and it's a list, so we need a traverse, but then we need to filter this traverse, right? And we're composing this prism with something called unsafe select. In fact, let me actually show this to you somewhere in the Monocle documentation. If we go to, I think it's in type classes, maybe not, maybe FAQ. Let me actually search for unsafe module. Yeah, there we go. So first of all, this is an extra dependency, right, that you need to add if you want to use it. And the problem is that this one, it violates some of the laws. I believe it's the law of composition. I don't understand 100% what's happening here, but essentially, if you were to compose two functions with basically two predicates that would sort of filter down the list, there is a difference between doing it like that and just throwing it into one of your optics, or whether to run it through your optics was only the first function, and then run it to the optics was the second function. Because if you're doing a modify, then the first predicate might filter some stuff out, and then you're not going to get the same result as was composing the functions together and running through your optics only once. Okay, therefore it is in an extra module. You need to add it to your dependencies. It's an extra dependency, and it's called very dangerously. It's called unsafe select. It's under a special import, and you basically can filter things. Okay, let's go back to the code. How did I skip this one? This is the most important one. All right, so again, like Quicklens sort of hides this complexity for you. And by the way, in most cases, it's not such a big deal that this law is broken. You can still write useful code with it, and write unit tests anyway, right? There's never a reason to to not, and there's never a good reason to not write a unit test. All right. So again, we're going to the addresses. We're having a lens into the addresses. It's a list, so we're doing a traverse. But then we have a prism because it might not be a sum inside of there, right? Then we need to go to have another lens so that we can go inside of the street. The street is another option, so we need to traverse it, right? So we could have used like a composed prism over there. Okay, so then we're going to go into the street again with a prism, and we're going to say only if the name starts with 1, only then let's go into the name and actually change it. All right, so this one was the most important one, and in fact I've actually written a code over here that basically creates a simple traversal of a list of integer, and we're composing it with a prism that basically just keeps the even ones, and then we are running the tests that come from Monocle, and if you see it's ignored. If I actually don't ignore it and actually run it, then we're going to see that it's going to fail, right? So it fails, and it generates some input and says, okay, if you put these things in, it's not going to work out, right? So, and I believe that if we jump into traversal tests, which come from Monocle, that you see over here, I believe it's this compose modify, right? So basically, I believe that it is this law that is going to fail, right? So basically, if you're doing modify twice, or if you didn't modify once, but you're composing the functions together, the results sometimes might be different, and therefore it is technically not a not a clean traverse. All right, I believe I said everything that I wanted to say. I'm going to push this thing again, with all the modifications, and you can go through it at your own pace. Enjoy both Monocle and Quicklens. They're pretty much, they're very good libraries. Choose whatever you prefer. For now, as always, it's been Vlad, devinside.com. Don't forget to like this video if you did, subscribe if you want to improve the developer inside you, and if you learned something today, consider supporting me on Patreon. But most importantly, take care.